It is shortly after midnight on January 24, 1961. The Cold War is at its freezing point. High above the sleeping farmlands of North Carolina, a metal giant is screaming in the dark. This is a B-52G Stratofortress, call sign Keep 19. It is the pride of the Strategic Air Command, a machine built to deliver the apocalypse to the Soviet Union. But tonight, it is not fighting the Soviets. It is fighting to stay in the air. Inside the fuselage, tucked away in the bomb bay, are two Mark 39 hydrogen bombs. Each one carries a yield of nearly 4 megatons. To put that into perspective, the bomb that destroyed Hiroshima was roughly 15 kilotons. A single Mark 39 is 250 times more powerful than that. And right now, two of them are dangling inside a disintegrating aircraft directly above American soil. This is not a drill. This is not a simulation. This is the story of how the United States Air Force came within a single electrical switch of detonating a nuclear weapon on its own east coast. To understand how we reached this terrifying moment, we must look back just a few hours earlier. The mission was part of Operation Chrome Dome. This was an airborne alert program initiated by General Thomas Power. The strategy was simple but exhausting. At any given moment, 24 hours a day, the United States kept a fleet of nuclear-armed B-52 bombers in the air, circling the borders of the Soviet Union. They were the stick ready to strike if the Soviets ever decided to launch a surprise attack. If Moscow launched their missiles, these bombers were already airborne, ready to cross the Arctic and retaliate before the U.S. airbases could be destroyed. Major Walter Tulloch was in command of Keep 19 that night. He was an experienced pilot, and the crew was well trained. They took off from Seymour Johnson Air Force Base in Goldsboro, North Carolina, for a standard long-endurance patrol loop across the Atlantic. The flight was routine until the bomber rendezvoused with a KC-135 Stratotanker for mid-air refueling. This is a standard procedure for Chrome Dome missions, which often lasted 24 hours. However, as the tanker boom operator looked down at the massive wings of the B-52, he saw something wrong. Jet fuel was gushing out of the right wing. It was not a minor drip. It was a torrent. The B-52G model was known as a wet wing aircraft, meaning the fuel was stored directly inside the wing structure rather than in rubber bladders. This saved weight, but it made the wings more prone to leaks if the structure was stressed. The tanker commander immediately radioed Major Tulloch, informing him of the heavy leak. The refueling was aborted. The mission was scrubbed. Ground control at Seymour Johnson Air Force Base ordered Keep 19 to enter a holding pattern off the coast to burn off excess fuel before attempting a landing. A fully loaded B-52 is incredibly heavy, and landing with full tanks and live nuclear weapons is a risk no one wants to take unless absolutely necessary. For several hours, the crew circled, dumping fuel and consuming it, trying to lighten the load. The tension in the cockpit was palpable, but manageable. They were professionals. They had handled mechanical issues before. But as they finally turned back toward land to approach the airfield, the situation deteriorated rapidly. The leak had worsened. We now know that the fuel loss had created a severe weight imbalance. The right wing was significantly lighter than the left wing, making the aircraft difficult to control. As Major Tulloch began his descent to 10,000 feet, the massive bomber became unstable. The pilots fought the yoke, struggling to keep the wings level. The aircraft began to wallow, dipping dangerously. Suddenly, at approximately 10,000 feet, the unthinkable happened. The structural integrity of the right wing failed. The sheer stress of the weight imbalance and the turbulence caused the wing to snap. It didn't just bend, it sheared off completely. Imagine a structure the size of an office building collapsing in seconds. The loss of the wing was catastrophic. The B-52 immediately entered a violent, uncontrollable flat spin. The G-forces inside the cockpit skyrocketed. The world outside the canopy became a blur of dark clouds and rain. The centrifugal force was so intense that it pinned the crew members against the walls of the aircraft. Major Tulloch, realizing the plane was lost, gave the order that every pilot dreads giving. Eject! 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 5 crew members managed to punch out. They were blasted into the freezing night air, their parachutes opening into the storm. But 3 men were still trapped inside. And as the fuselage spun like a falling leaf, the immense G-forces began to tear the airframe apart piece by piece. The tail section broke away. The fuselage twisted and groaned under the strain. And then, the bomb bay doors, designed to open only upon a specific command sequence, were ripped from their hinges by the sheer violence of the spin. This is the moment where an aviation accident became a nuclear crisis. As the plane disintegrated, the 2 Mark 39 hydrogen bombs were flung out of the wreckage. They were no longer secured. They were free-falling objects. These were weapons designed to level Moscow, now tumbling through the night sky over the tobacco fields of Faro, North Carolina. The first bomb fell like a stone. It was not aerodynamic, it was a heavy, blunt object falling at terminal velocity. It slammed into a muddy field at nearly 700 miles per hour, burying itself deep into the swampy earth. But the second bomb behaved differently. As it fell, the chaotic motion and the rushing wind tricked its internal mechanisms. The bomb's onboard computer sensed the altitude drop. It sensed the speed. It sensed the barometric pressure changes. Inside the falling weapon, a series of mechanical gears began to turn. The bomb did not know it was in an accident. It did not know it was over North Carolina. As far as the weapon's logic systems were concerned, it had been released over a target. It was doing exactly what it was designed to do. The arming sequence initiated. A high-voltage thermal battery activated, powering up the firing circuits. The barometric switches clicked shut. And then, with a snap of canvas that would have been audible over the storm, a 100-foot diameter parachute deployed from the back of the bomb. The parachute caught the wind, jerking the weapon upright. It began to drift down slowly, steadily, swaying in the dark, armed and ready to detonate. The fate of the East Coast now hung by a thread, dependent on safety switches that were rapidly failing, one by one. The bomber was gone. The crew was scattered in the woods. And 2 hydrogen bombs were about to make landfall. The silence that followed the destruction of Keep 19 was almost as deafening as the explosion itself. In the muddy fields of Faro, approximately 12 miles north of Goldsboro, the wreckage of the massive B-52 was scattered across a wide area of tobacco farmland and dense forest. The fuselage had crashed with such violence that it gouged a massive scar into the earth, igniting a fierce fire fueled by the remaining jet fuel. But amidst the burning debris and the twisted aluminum, a far more urgent crisis was unfolding in the dark. The survivors of the crew, dazed and injured, were landing in their parachutes. Major Tulloch, the aircraft commander, landed safely. In a twist of fate, Adam Maddox, the 3rd pilot, became the first African American to successfully eject from a B-52 without an ejection seat, tumbling out of the top hatch into the freezing void. But not everyone was so lucky. 3 brave airmen, Major Eugene Shelton, Major Eugene Richards, and Sergeant Francis Barnish, did not survive the breakup. Their tragedy, however, was about to be overshadowed by the potential death of millions. Within minutes of the crash, the military communication lines lit up. The code phrase "Broken Arrow" was transmitted to the highest levels of the Pentagon and the Strategic Air Command. This was the classified designator for an accident involving a nuclear weapon. At Seymour Johnson Air Force Base, the reaction was immediate and massive. Explosive Ordnance Disposal (EOD) teams were scrambled. They were told that a bomber was down, but as they raced toward the crash site in their trucks, navigating the wet, dark country roads, few of them grasped the full magnitude of what lay waiting for them in the mud. They were not just looking for wreckage, they were hunting for 2 live hydrogen bombs that had vanished into the night. The first weapon was discovered relatively quickly. It was the bomb that had deployed its parachute. As the search teams fanned out with flashlights cutting through the misty rain, they saw something surreal. There, standing upright in a field, was the Mark 39. The massive 100-foot parachute had caught in the upper branches of a tree, gently lowering the weapon so that its nose was just barely touching the ground. It stood there like a monolith, alien and terrifyingly intact. To the untrained eye, it looked like the weapon had survived the fall perfectly. To the trained experts of the EOD team, specifically Lieutenant Jack Revell who led the recovery, the sight was the stuff of nightmares. A deployed parachute meant the bomb's internal logic believed it was in a combat scenario. Lieutenant Ravel and his team approached the weapon with extreme caution. They knew that inside this metal casing was a physics package capable of generating a heat flash hotter than the center of the sun. Ravel began the terrifying process of examining the arming indicators. These were small windows on the side of the bomb that displayed the status of the internal switches. He wiped the mud and moisture from the first window. It showed armed. His heart must have skipped a beat. He moved to the second window. Armed. The third window. Armed. The sequence was horrifyingly clear. The physical trauma of the plane breaking up, combined with the free fall and the parachute deployment, had systematically clicked through the safety protocols. The bomb had charged its capacitors. It had closed the firing circuits. It had prepared the thermal batteries. There was only one switch left. The pilot's safe arm switch. This was a simple, low-voltage toggle switch in the cockpit that the pilot would manually flip before dropping the weapon in a real war. Because the plane had broken apart before the pilot could touch that switch, it had remained in the safe position. However, the shock of the breakup could have easily shorted the wires. Ravel and his team carefully opened the access panel to check the final barrier. They found that the switch was indeed in the safe position. But the margin was razor thin. Later analysis would reveal that the high-voltage battery had already activated. The weapon was fully powered. If that one simple switch had suffered a short circuit during the violent disintegration of the fuselage, the firing signal would have been sent to the nuclear core. The bomb would have detonated. The blast would have vaporized the recovery team instantly. The fireball would have expanded for miles. Fallout would have drifted north, potentially reaching Washington, D.C. and New York City. The United States would have nuked itself. While Ravel's team was sweating over the parachute bomb, a second team was desperately searching for the other weapon. This search was far more difficult. The second bomb had not deployed its parachute. It had hit the ground in a free fall, traveling at nearly terminal velocity. It didn't land, it penetrated. The team found the impact site in a muddy, waterlogged field that the locals would later call the bay. There was no bomb to be seen. Instead, there was a crater filled with muddy water and twisted metal. The impact was so violent that the bomb had acted like a bunker buster, burying itself deep into the soft, swampy soil of North Carolina. The recovery effort for the second bomb became a massive excavation project. The Air Force brought in heavy digging equipment, pumps, and shoring gear. They began to dig, but the water table was high, and the hole kept filling with sludge. As they dug deeper, they began to find pieces of the weapon. They found the tail assembly. They found crumpled pieces of the casing. But the physics package, the nuclear core containing the uranium and plutonium, was missing. It had separated from the casing and continued to dive deeper into the quicksand like Earth. The situation was critical. Even without a nuclear explosion, the conventional high explosives inside the bomb could still detonate, scattering radioactive material across the countryside, creating a massive dirty bomb incident. Days turned into weeks. The excavation pit grew deeper and wider. The conditions were miserable. The men worked in freezing mud, constantly pumping out water, terrified that their shovels might strike the detonators. Finally, they located the plutonium pit, the primary stage of the weapon. It was recovered and secured. But the secondary stage, the uranium component that provided the massive thermonuclear yield, was nowhere to be found. It had plunged past the 50-foot mark, possibly deeper. The ground was swallowing it whole. The Air Force eventually realized that they could not safely recover the secondary stage without risking the collapse of the excavation and the lives of the diggers. A difficult decision had to be made. They would recover what they could, but the uranium heart of the second bomb would have to stay there. Meanwhile, back at the laboratory, engineers were dissecting the remains of the switches from the parachute bomb. The results of the autopsy on the weapon were chilling. Secretary of Defense Robert McNamara would later declassify documents stating that, by the slightest margin of chance, literally the failure of two wires to cross, a nuclear explosion was averted. The investigation revealed that the safety mechanisms of 1961 were dangerously inadequate. The switches were not designed to withstand the sheer physical forces of an aircraft breaking apart in midair. The arming sequence was too easily triggered by environmental factors. The parachute, designed to save the bomb for a precise detonation, had almost caused an accidental apocalypse. The realization sent shockwaves through the nuclear establishment. They had assumed the weapons were safe. They were wrong. The Goldsboro incident proved that the probability of an accidental detonation was not zero. It was statistically significant. And on that freezing night in January, America had gambled with its own existence and won, not by skill, but by the flip of a coin, or rather, the position of a single, $2 switch. The decision to seal the earth over the lost weapon marked the end of the recovery operation, but it was only the beginning of the incident's long, shadowy afterlife. The United States Air Force faced a unique and unprecedented problem. They had successfully recovered the plutonium pit, the trigger of the bomb, but the thermonuclear secondary stage, containing a significant amount of highly enriched uranium-235, was irretrievable. It sat roughly 180 feet below the surface, swallowed by the fluid geology of the North Carolina coastal plain. To continue digging was deemed too dangerous, the water infiltration made the pit unstable, and there was a genuine fear that further heavy machinery operation could disturb the unexploded ordnance or cause a cave-in that would kill the recovery crew. So, the order was given to fill the hole. The Air Force purchased an easement on the land from the local property owners. It was a strange legal arrangement. The farmers could keep the land, they could grow their crops, and they could walk on the surface. But they were strictly forbidden from digging. A permanent restriction was placed on the deed: no excavation below a depth of 5 feet. The military effectively purchased a cylinder of earth extending from the topsoil down to the center of the planet. To this day, the uranium heart of a thermonuclear weapon lies rusting in the dark beneath a quiet soybean field in Faro. It is a silent, invisible tomb, unmarked by any grand monument, a radioactive ghost of the Cold War that will remain there for millennia. For decades, the true gravity of what happened in Goldsboro was shielded from the American public. The official press releases at the time were carefully sanitized. They acknowledged that a B-52 had crashed and that 2 weapons had been recovered. They insisted there was never any danger of a nuclear explosion. The Air Force played down the failure of the safety switches, framing the recovery as a success of the system rather than a terrifying near miss. It wasn't until 50 years later, in 2013, when investigative journalist Eric Schlosser obtained declassified documents through the Freedom of Information Act, that the world learned how close we truly came to the brink. Among the documents was a secret report written in 1969 by Parker F. Jones, the supervisor of the Nuclear Weapons Safety Department at Sandia National Laboratories. Jones was the man tasked with analyzing the failure. His report was written with a tone of dry, terrified sarcasm. He titled a section of the report "How I Learned to Mistrust the H-Bomb," a direct reference to the chaotic satire of the film Dr. Strangelove. But Jones wasn't laughing. In his analysis, he noted that the Mark 39 bomb's safety system was almost entirely reliant on the pre-arm generator, a mechanism that was supposed to be triggered only by the specific sequence of a drop. But the physical trauma of the crash had bypassed nearly every check. Jones wrote a chilling sentence that should be etched into the history of the atomic age: one simple, dynamo technology, low-voltage switch stood between the United States and a major catastrophe. He concluded that the 39 Malawian Quachas Mod 2 bomb did not possess adequate safety for the airborne alert role. The Goldsboro incident became a quiet turning point in nuclear history. It terrified the Kennedy administration. When President John F. Kennedy was briefed on the accident and told just how close a detonation had been, he was reportedly shaken. The incident shattered the illusion that nuclear weapons were dormant giants that only woke up when commanded. It proved they were volatile, complex machines that could turn on their creators due to a bad wire or a sudden jolt. This realization drove a massive overhaul in nuclear weapon design. It accelerated the implementation of PAL's permissive action links. Before Goldsboro, the safety of a nuke was largely mechanical. After Goldsboro, the philosophy shifted to electronic control. Permissive action links are essentially coded electronic locks inside the weapon. Even if the bomb is armed, dropped, and the fuses are active, the physics package will not detonate without a specific code being entered. It was a shift from preventing the drop to preventing the bang. The modern nuclear arsenal of the United States owes much of its safety architecture to the terrifying failure analysis of the two bombs that fell on North Carolina. The engineers at Sandia and Los Alamos had to redesign everything to ensure that a crash, a fire, or a lightning strike could never again trick a bomb into thinking it was fighting World War III. Today, if you drive past the crash site in Faro, you will not see a crater. You will not see a scorched wasteland. You will see a small, unassuming roadside marker, erected long after the event, commemorating the crew of Keep 19. The field looks like any other patch of North Carolina farmland. The corn grows tall in the summer, and the wind blows through the trees where the parachute once caught. It is peaceful. But the locals know what lies beneath. They know that they are walking on top of a dormant monster. The broken arrow at Goldsboro serves as a permanent reminder of the fragility of human control over the forces we have harnessed. We built these weapons to ensure our survival, to deter an enemy from across the ocean. Yet, on that rainy night in 1961, the enemy wasn't the Soviet Union. The enemy was gravity. The enemy was a faulty fuel valve. The enemy was the inherent chaos of a complex mechanical system. We survived not because of our wisdom, and not because of our technology. We survived because of luck. Pure, blind luck. And as long as the uranium remains buried in that field, humanity will always have a physical reminder of the night the luck almost ran out. The night the sky fell, and the earth held its breath.